In the quiet town of Gravewood, I've worn the badge of the law for more years than I care to count. Sheriff Daniel Carter, that's the name folks know and respect, or at least I like to believe so. Gravewood's a place where the biggest ruckus is usually a tipped cow or a bar fight at Manny's Tavern, nothing a good talk and a firm handshake can't handle. But if these years have taught me anything, it's that calm waters can hide treacherous currents. Nights here are as dark as pitch, the kind of darkness that seems almost alive, pressing against the windows of my cruiser as I patrol the empty streets. I've always been a man of logic, a skeptic. Ghost stories and superstitions never found fertile ground in my mind. I've seen my share of oddities, sure, the occasional unexplained happening that comes with life in a small town. But I've always found a way to rationalize them, to file them away in the cabinet of my mind marked unsolved, but not unearthly. Yet, there's a part of every man's soul that knows fear, the primal, guttural kind that's been passed down from ancient ancestors who survived by their wariness of the dark. I've felt that fear on nights when the wind howled like the cries of the damned and shadows seemed to dance just beyond the reach of my headlights. I've pushed it down, buried it under layers of reason and disbelief. But it's there, a silent companion on my solitary patrols. As I sit in my cruiser, staring out into the abyss of the night, I can't shake the feeling that all my years of skepticism were a mere prelude. A prelude to an event that would challenge the very foundations of what I believe, what I stand for. I've always thought I was prepared for anything this job could throw at me. But nothing could have prepared me for the events that began with a routine patrol on a road that I'd driven 1,000 times, a road that on that fateful night led me straight into the maw of the inexplicable. It was the night the abyss gazed back into me, the night that the quiet town of Gravewood and I were swept into the eye of a storm so bizarre, so chilling, that it would forever blur the line between the world we know and those we dare not speak of. The cult of the abyss, they called themselves, but what they brought with them was more than just chants and cloaks. It was a darkness, a whisper in the void, that once heard, could never be unheard. So, as I recount these events, remember, I'm a man of logic, a skeptic. But what I witnessed, what we all witnessed, has shaken the bedrock of my disbelief. And as I share this tale, maybe you'll understand why, or maybe you'll cast it aside as the ramblings of a man who's seen too much through tired eyes. Either way, the story of that night, the story of the cult of the abyss, begins here, with me, a wounded stranger, and a rural hospital about to become the nexus of unspeakable horrors. The night was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes you aware of every shallow breath. I was halfway through my shift, the monotony of the empty roads lulling me into a state of alert drowsiness. That's when I saw him, a figure limping along the side of the road, his silhouette barely discernible in the dim glow of my headlights. I pulled up beside him, rolling down my window with a creak that seemed overly loud in the stillness. "You all right there, buddy?" I asked, my eyes scanning him for any obvious signs of trouble. He was a mess, clothes torn and stained dark with what I could only hope was mud. His eyes, wide with a primal sort of fear, darted around before settling on me. He tried to speak, but his words were a garbled mess, punctuated by harsh breaths. I caught something about shadows and a gathering, but it was the blood seeping through his shirt that made my decision for me. Without a second thought, I radioed in for backup in an ambulance, but with the nearest hospital a good hour's drive and the man's condition worsening by the second, I knew I had to take matters into my own hands. I helped him into the passenger seat of my cruiser, his groans of pain a stark reminder of the urgency of the situation. I floored the accelerator, the hospital in Gravewood my only focus. The hospital, a small 2-story building that had seen better days, loomed out of the darkness like a beacon. I rushed the man inside, the automatic doors sluggishly parting to admit us into the sterile fluorescent-lit lobby. The place was eerily quiet, the usual night shift staff reduced to a skeleton crew who seemed almost as startled by our arrival as they were by the man's condition. Dr. Emily Harris, her face a mask of concentration, took charge as soon as we wheeled the man into the emergency room. Her team moved with practiced efficiency, their actions a well-rehearsed dance of life-saving measures. But it was the man's words, whispered with a fervency that bordered on the fanatic, that chilled me to the bone. "The abyss. It's coming," he rasped, his eyes locking with mine before he succumbed to unconsciousness. The waiting was the worst part. I paced the empty corridors of the hospital, the man's belongings, a wallet, a strange amulet, and a notebook filled with cryptic notes and unsettling sketches in my hands. Something was off, the air charged with a tension that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Then it began. The lights flickered, a stuttering heartbeat in the quiet of the hospital. The radio, left on the reception desk, crackled to life, its static-filled broadcast morphing into a series of eerie, unintelligible sounds that seemed almost like words, but not in any language I'd ever heard. I reached for my phone, only to find no signal, the bars replaced by an ominous no-service message. A sense of isolation settled over me, heavy and suffocating. We were cut off, the hospital an island in a sea of darkness. And as the shadows seemed to press closer against the windows, I knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the night was far from over. The man's words echoed in my mind, a portent of things to come. The abyss. It's coming. And come it did. The hospital's walls, once a bastion of safety, now felt like the fragile boundaries of a besieged fortress. Outside, the darkness seemed to thicken, taking on a life of its own. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was as if the very essence of shadow had descended upon us, a tangible, suffocating cloak. The whispers started softly, a sinister susurrus that seemed to seep through the walls. They grew in intensity, a chorus of disjointed chants that sent shivers down my spine. I peered through the windows, my hand resting on the butt of my service revolver. The sight that met my eyes was something out of a twisted ritualistic rite. Hooded figures, their faces obscured by the darkness. Their chants rose and fell in a rhythm that was almost hypnotic, their bodies swaying like reeds in a slow, unseen wind. The standoff was broken by a sudden, violent force. The front doors of the hospital, sturdy and solid, shuddered under the impact of the cultists' bodies hurling against them. Glass shattered, the sound piercing the night like a scream. I drew my gun, the familiar weight a small comfort in the face of the unknown. The cultists, if you could still call them human, were relentless. Their eyes, when they met mine, held a depth of madness that no sane person could fathom. We fought them off, Dr. Harris, a couple of nurses, and I, using whatever was at hand. The cultists were strong, unnaturally so, but they were also disorganized, their movements chaotic, driven by frenzy rather than purpose. We managed to secure the entrance, but it was clear this was just the beginning. The cultists regrouped quickly, their numbers seemingly undiminished. We retreated further into the hospital, barricading doors, blocking hallways, anything to put a barrier between us and them. As we fortified our position, I stumbled upon a set of old, dust-covered files in the hospital's record room. The pages, yellowed with age, spoke of the hospital's founding on grounds that were once the site of ancient rituals. The cult of the abyss, as the files named them, were not just a local myth but a historical reality, their presence in Gravewood dating back centuries. The more I read, the more the pieces started to fit together. The wounded man, the cultist's sudden appearance, the hospital's specific targeting, it was all connected to a past that Gravewood had long forgotten, or perhaps chosen to ignore. And now, it seemed, that past had returned to claim its due. Outside, the night raged on. The cultists, their chants now a deafening roar, continued their assault. But it was the deeper, more guttural sounds that followed, sounds that no human throat could produce, that filled me with a dread I had never known. The siege was far from over, and as I clutched the files to my chest, I realized that the true battle was just beginning. The battle not just for our lives, but for the very soul of Gravewood. The hospital's walls trembled under the relentless assault, the boundary between the known and the unknown wearing thinner with each passing moment. Outside, the cultists' chants had transformed into a cacophony of otherworldly calls, a symphony of the abyss that clouded the edges of sanity. Then they came, the creatures, slipping through the shadows like nightmares given form. They defied description, their shapes fluid and ever-changing, a grotesque parody of life as we knew it. Their presence was an affront to reality, a violation of every natural law. Dr. Harris and I watched, horror-struck, as they twisted the very air around them, warping the hospital's corridors into impossible geometries. The staff and patients, driven by a primal urge to survive, rallied despite their fear. We fought, not just against the cultists and their monstrous allies, but against the creeping despair that threatened to engulf us. Each hallway defended, every door barricaded, became a small victory, a defiant stand against the encroaching darkness. In the eye of the storm, the wounded man, his body a tapestry of pain, stirred from his unconscious state. His eyes, clear for the first time since I'd found him, held a depth of sorrow and knowledge that spoke of experiences no man should endure. He spoke of the cult of the abyss, not as distant folklore, but as a living, breathing entity. The hospital, he revealed, was built upon a ley line, a conduit of ancient power that the cult sought to exploit to bring their deity into our world. His words painted a grim picture. The gathering, the siege, it was all a ritual, a cosmic alignment meant to tear down the barriers between the dimensions. And we, the unwilling occupants of the hospital, were part of it, pawns in a game whose stakes were incomprehensible. The revelation was a heavy burden, the weight of it almost crushing. But it also brought clarity. We were not just fighting for our lives, we were fighting for the very fabric of reality. And as the wounded man's whispers mingled with the distant otherworldly cries, I knew that the final act of this nightmarish drama was upon us. The hospital, our makeshift fortress, stood as the last bulwark against the abyss. And I, Sheriff Daniel Carter, along with a band of ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances, prepared to make our stand. Because to give in, to let the darkness consume us, was to surrender everything we knew, everything we were. And that was a price too steep to pay. So we fortified, we planned, and we waited. The abyss, with all its madness and malice, was at our doorstep. And we, the last defenders of Gravewood, were ready to meet it head-on. The hospital, once a sanctuary of healing, had transformed into a battlefield, the epicenter of a struggle that transcended human understanding. The air crackled with a palpable tension, a prelude to the storm that was about to break. The cultists, emboldened by the presence of their otherworldly allies, launched their fiercest assault yet. We met them head-on, our determination a stark contrast to their frenzied zeal. The creatures, their forms an affront to nature, twisted the space around them, distorting reality with their mere presence. But we discovered that their power was not absolute. Light, both literal and figurative, seemed to repel them, a beacon of hope in the engulfing darkness. Dr. Harris, her face set in a mask of resolve, orchestrated our defense with a calmness that belied the chaos around us. Together, we held the line, our wills united against the encroaching void. Each corridor held, every creature repelled, felt like a small victory, a defiant assertion of our existence against the abyss. In the midst of the turmoil, a figure emerged from the shadows, the cult leader. His presence was commanding, a stark embodiment of the abyss's allure. He offered me a choice, a place in the new world they aimed to create. The temptation was a siren's call, a promise of power and knowledge beyond mortal comprehension. But it was the wounded man, his eyes burning with an urgent intensity, who reminded me of what was at stake. He held the key, a fragment of the ritual that could either seal the portal or open it fully. The decision lay heavy on my shoulders, a choice between the seductive unknown and the familiar world I had sworn to protect. With a clarity born of desperation, I chose Gravewood, its people, and the reality I knew. Together with the wounded man and Dr. Harris, we turned the cult's own symbols against them, a reversal of the ritual that would seal the portal and banish the abyss. The battle raged, the hospital a nexus of clashing wills and realities. The cult leader, his facade of control shattered, fought to reclaim the ritual, his followers a chaotic swarm of desperation and madness. The creatures, their forms unraveling under the barrage of light and collective resolve, became a maelstrom of dissipating nightmares. And then, in a moment that seemed to hang suspended in time, the portal closed. The pressure that had weighed on us lifted, a sudden release that left us reeling. The cultists, their connection to the abyss severed, collapsed, their zeal extinguished. The creatures, their forms an affront to reality, faded into the ether, their presence a rapidly fading nightmare. The hospital, battered and scarred, stood defiant, a testament to our struggle. Around me, the staff and patients, their faces a mix of exhaustion and relief, began to comprehend the enormity of what had occurred. The night, once a canvas of terror, gradually gave way to the first light of dawn, a new day breaking over Gravewood. But the world I returned to was not the same. The abyss had touched us all, leaving its indelible mark on our souls. I knew that our victory was not just a triumph over the cultists or the creatures, but over the fear and despair that had sought to consume us. As I walked through the corridors of the hospital, the scenes of the night struggle still vivid in my mind, I realized that the battle might be over, but the war, the eternal war against the darkness that lurks at the edges of our reality, was just beginning. And I, Sheriff Daniel Carter, would be ready to face it, armed with the knowledge and courage that had been forged in the crucible of the abyss. The cult of the abyss had been vanquished, but the shadows they had summoned lingered. Gravewood would heal, its scars a silent testament to the night when reality itself had hung in the balance. And I, forever changed by the ordeal, would carry the story of that night, a reminder of the fragile veil that separates our world from the unknown. But for now, the dawn was breaking, a new day was upon us, and the hospital, its walls echoing with the whispers of the night's terrors, stood as a beacon of hope, a fortress against the darkness, ready to face whatever the future might hold. As the first light of dawn filtered through the broken windows, casting long shadows on the worn-out floors of the hospital, the weight of the night's event settled upon us. The silence was deafening, a stark contrast to the cacophony of the abyss that had just moments ago threatened to consume everything. I stood in the midst of it all, feeling the gaze of Dr. Harris and the others resting on me. We were survivors, but at what cost? The cult of the abyss had vanished, their ritual thwarted, but the echoes of their chants lingered like a bad memory. The wounded man, the unexpected hero of the night, lay exhausted but at peace, his part in this ordeal finally over. I couldn't help but wonder about the choices we'd made, the sacrifices that had been necessary to hold back the darkness. The line between our world and the abyss had been blurred, and though we'd managed to restore the boundary, the scars left behind would not heal easily. The people of Gravewood, and perhaps even the world beyond, remained blissfully unaware of how close we'd come to the brink of annihilation. In the days that followed, the hospital slowly returned to its routine, the staff attending to the needs of the town as if nothing had happened. But for those of us who'd stood together against the abyss, things could never go back to the way they were. We shared a bond forged in the fires of a battle that could never be spoken of, a silent understanding that transcended words. The wounded man, once a pawn in the cult's grand scheme, had chosen to stay in Gravewood. His knowledge of the abyss and its denizens made him an invaluable ally, a guardian against the darkness that we now knew lurked just beyond the veil of our reality. Dr. Harris, her strength and resolve unshaken, continued to heal the wounds of the body and the mind, a beacon of hope in a world that had seen too much darkness. As for me, Sheriff Daniel Carter, I returned to my duties with a new perspective. The shadows that had once been mere figments of the imagination now held a different meaning. I patrolled the streets of Gravewood with a keener eye, aware of the thin barrier that separated us from the unknown. The cult of the abyss was a chapter in Gravewood's history that would remain hidden, a tale too unbelievable for the light of day. But its legacy lived on in those who had faced the darkness and prevailed. As I sat in my cruiser, watching the sunset on another day, the radio crackled to life, a call breaking the quiet of the evening. It was routine, a part of the job that had defined my life for so long. But as I drove through the streets of Gravewood, I couldn't shake the feeling that the abyss was still out there, waiting, watching. The battle had been won, but the war, the eternal vigil against the darkness, was just beginning. And I, Sheriff Daniel Carter, along with the brave souls of Gravewood, would be ready to face it, whatever it may bring. For we knew now that the abyss didn't just gaze back, it whispered, it called, and it remembered. And so, with the night drawing in, I drove on, the shadows my constant companions, a reminder of the fragile line between our world and the abyss, a line that we, the guardians of Gravewood, would forever stand watch over.
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed the video. We highly recommend you watch the next video here. Oops. I'm waiting for you to click. Yes, you've clicked. Happy watching.